Okay. Wait, yes, no, yes. We're good? Okay. All right. Let's pray and then we'll start. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for this time that we could study your word and really dig into these chapters and some of these familiar stories with fresh eyes. Lord, I just pray that your Holy Spirit would speak through me. God, that you would open up our hearts of those in this room and those listening online and really teach us what you want us to know from your word this morning. I just thank you so much for your presence, for your love, for your patience with us, for your mercy. And I just pray that we would see all of those elements of your character as we talk through some of these chapters. We love you. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, it's nice to be back with you guys. I hope you enjoyed. Jen Wilkin is a great teacher. So those of you who watched the video, I hope that you enjoyed listening to her and all of that too. I do learn a lot from watching her videos and stuff. So I hope that worked okay last week. I heard that God of Creation started playing instead of God of Covenant, but you guys got it figured out, so I'm glad. And you all have access to her videos in the back of your book, so if you ever want to go back and refresh on something, you totally can. So, okay, so we've got 7 chapters today. And this is going to allow us to finish up before Memorial Day, so we're right on track. This is the last week we have to combine any chapters, so we can kind of go back to our normal pace after this. If you didn't have a chance to read through the chapters, I would encourage you to do so when you get a chance, just because I'm going to have to summarize a lot. We're not going to go as verse by verse as we have with some of the other sessions. So if you haven't read them, then I would suggest going back so you'll have a little more context. I was chatting with someone on Sunday morning, though, just about how it's been so great to study Genesis like this, for me anyways, because it just truly is such the context giver for the rest of the Bible. Did you notice how James mentioned Cain and Abel in his talk on Ecclesiastes? And I just was like, oh, that's so cool, because that's so fresh in our minds. You know, we just studied that, if you did that first round of study with us. And so it's just so neat to see how we find these stories and these themes and all of these things kind of recurring throughout the Bible. And the more we study, the better understanding we have. Because now I look at Ecclesiastes in a completely different way when I think of that word Hevel for Abel's name, knowing more about Abel and what that now means in Ecclesiastes. So it's really fun to kind of see how God allows us to make those connections and how we can see his word is so alive and breathes life into us, right? So week 6 of this study covers Genesis 29 through 33. And these chapters provide some significant insight into one of the main questions that the original audience would have had, which is, how did the Israelites end up in Egypt? So we're starting to get more and more context into that. That's what the original audience wanted to know. They also would have wanted to know, where did the 12 sons come from? And why are there 12 tribes associated with these 12 sons? To us, that's not a question, because we've grown up hearing these stories, right? And that is familiar to us. But for them, they wouldn't have had this in written form yet. So Moses is really giving them a lot of their own history, and they're going to identify with those 12 names that we'll see come through. Okay, so many of these stories are very familiar to us, especially if you grew up in the church. But I hope that you got some fresh insight as you read through them. And it sounds like, based on our small group discussion, a lot of us did. So you may have grown up hearing about this great romance between Jacob and Rachel and how much Jacob loved Rachel, right? But what we actually read in the text is not a great romance. It's pretty terrible for everybody involved. We see that Jacob continues this pattern of deceit and self-reliance. He likes to control things over and over. Jacob knew that God had promised him the birthright and the blessing, and yet what did we see? We saw him use deceit to forcefully take it when he didn't need to do that. we see Jacob fall into some of these same patterns that Abraham and Isaac did when they lied to preserve themselves, and Jacob will do the same. Have you guys ever heard the story about how your parents met? Or have you told the story to your kids about how you met? It can be a really fun thing to know, right? So my parents, they grew up in completely different places. My dad grew up in California, Central California, and my mom grew up in Missouri. My mom went to the University of Missouri. She came from a very Irish Catholic family. She was number 2 in 8 kids. She went to college, not having a personal relationship with the Lord, and she got involved with the Navigators, which is a Christian ministry organization. And through them, she became a believer, which caused her to be all but disowned from her family because Catholicism was very, very important to them. My dad, he kind of grew up in a Christian home, but it was more just going through the motions. It was farming community, so you'd go to church on Sunday, but he did not have a strong relationship with God. He went to the University of Purdue and got involved with the Navigators and really grew in his faith through college. After college, they still don't know each other yet, they both committed to move to Chicago, downtown, and to minister to the neighborhood there. They both had jobs that they worked, but then they were going to be part of the Navigators and minister to people in Chicago. So they both moved. There were 4 women with the Navigators that lived in one apartment and 4 men with the Navigators that lived in another apartment. Out of those 8 people, there were 3 marriages, and my parents were one of them. So it's just such a neat story, right? And we loved hearing it as kids, and I loved telling it, and especially because I know, we always say that. We're like, what was wrong with the other 2? But who knows? But, I mean, it makes sense. You know, you've got people same age, like-minded, all those things. But just such a neat way that God brought them together that, like, you couldn't have orchestrated that on our own, right? So we loved hearing it, and it's fresh in our minds, and we think about it and all of those things. I think the same was true for Jacob. I think the story of Isaac and Rebekah and how Abraham's servant went to Isaac's homeland and found Rebekah. That's a beautiful story of God's faithfulness. And I think that Jacob really grew up hearing that story a lot. And so I think that will influence kind of how we see what happens when he meets Rachel. Okay? So, we saw in our last session that Jacob was sent away. He's fleeing for his life at this point because he tricked Esau, and Esau wants to kill him. Rebekah urges him to go so that Esau can calm down. Isaac thinks he's sending Jacob back to their family to find a wife. Jacob probably thinks, well, great, I'm about to follow in my parents' footsteps and have this amazing romance, right? We know, though, that, like, even though he might think that, the real reason he's going is because he's scared for his life, understandably, but still. So he's fleeing. We see that Jacob is still pretty immature at this point. He knows who God is. There's no doubt about that. But he doesn't have that personal relationship with God. He is more in this relationship with God for what he can get out of it, how it will benefit him. As we go through these chapters, we're going to see Jacob mature as a result of some very difficult circumstances. In Genesis 29, we find Jacob coming to a well with 3 large flocks of sheep. Jacob talks to the herdsmen, and he finds that they are from Haran. So he asks if they know Laban. They answer yes. In fact, they say, Laban's daughter Rachel is on her way here right now. What do you think Isaac was feeling at that time? He's at a well. He's very close to where his parents, or where Abraham's servant found his dad's wife. So he's probably thinking, oh, I wonder if I'm about to follow in their footsteps. So then look at verses 10 through 12 of chapter 29. Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. I think Moses wants us to know who this is, right? Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. Aww. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. So that's a very intense reaction, right? It seems to me from that reaction that this encounter meant more to Jacob because he knew his parents' history than it would to a typical person at that time. So after that, we see Laban enter the narrative. And what do we know about Laban from our last encounter? Do you remember the first thing he noticed when he met Abraham's servant? He noticed all the jewelry, right, that Rebekah was wearing, that she was given. We know from reading these chapters that Laban is not a nice man. He knows that Jacob is someone who comes from wealth. And so Laban is going to capitalize that. Jacob the deceiver is about to meet his match. Verses 15 through 20. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob serves 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him like but a few days because of the love he had for her. Okay, so this is why we have probably had this story framed as this beautiful romance. I think he loved Rachel. I do think he loved Rachel. I just think that as the story goes on, it turns from being romantic to being horrific. And we'll see why. Not necessarily because of Jacob's initial fault, but as what happens and the decisions he makes as a result of those actions. Okay, so we see Jacob here. He is lovesick for Rachel, okay? But Laban has a problem. He has an older daughter who's not really marriageable based on cultural standards. So verse 17 says that her eyes were weak. This could mean that she had trouble seeing, but it probably had more to do with her appearance because it is laid right in opposition with the statement that Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. So it seems to be that we're contrasting Leah and Rachel here. There was something about her eyes that made her unattractive. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to be Leah, to grow up in Rachel's shadow your whole life? We know that power and favor are given to the beautiful. We see that all the way through today. In our social media, in our obsession with beauty. I mean, just go to any drugstore and look at the beauty section, right? We're obsessed. We're obsessed with it. Leah lived her life as a victim of a constant negative comparison to Rachel. Everywhere she went, she was either invisible or disdained. She's constantly reminded that she is never enough. This is important as we think through what happens to her. Verse 21, then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed." Okay, so Jacob's got one thing on his mind. It's been 7 years. He is ready, right? He wants to consummate this marriage. Laban is thrilled with this because Jacob's not quite thinking clearly here. He's going to use that to his advantage. Laban deceives Jacob and gives him Leah instead. Jacob doesn't even realize that it was Leah until the next morning. That seems bizarre to us, right? Like, how could that possibly happen? So a couple things we need to think about for this time in this culture. Leah would have been heavily veiled. That was the custom. So she would have had lots of different pieces of clothing on her. You would not be able to see her. Also, this celebration would have been going on for a long time, hours and hours and hours, well into the night. Remember where they live. They're in the middle of the desert. It gets very, very dark in the desert. So already she's veiled. It's super dark. Most likely, Jacob was participating in the celebration and probably consumed alcohol, right? I mean, we don't have it here. Again, this is commentary, but most commentators agree that that's probably what would have happened. So by the time he gets to his tent, his senses are compromised. The irony of this is that Jacob deceived his father in the very same way, right? He used his senses to deceive him, and now Jacob is the one whose senses are compromised and he is deceived. So growing up, the emphasis on this story was how wronged Jacob was in this. I mean, it is awful. He worked 7 years for Rachel and then is tricked. That's not great, right? But since this is a woman's study, let's talk about the women. Specifically, let's talk about Leah. Leah had no choice in this. We don't know if she agreed with this plan or not. But either way, if she did not, there was nothing she could have done about it. She had no agency in this culture, in this household. We already know that she had been treated with disdain for her whole life because she was not considered attractive. Leah had been overlooked, and she watched her sister be favored over and over again. In all likelihood, Laban instructed Leah to dress in Rachel's clothing to add to that deception. And she may have very well believed that this was her chance. She may have thought or had some hope, well, maybe Jacob will love me. Maybe I can experience love and favor, because you know that she was starving for that. And so in her mind, she could have thought, well, why not? Why not try this out, right? So then Jacob wakes up next to Leah and he's furious, which is understandable. But can you imagine how Leah felt hearing Jacob's words? She had this little bit of hope that maybe Jacob would come to accept her as his wife. But he's mad, and we can understand that. But what does Laban say? He says in verse 26, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." Well, that's kind of interesting, right? Because what did Jacob do as the younger? He deceived and stole the birthright and the blessing from his older son. So it's kind of interesting how this story plays out. So Laban comes up with this new plan. He tells Jacob, finish out the week with Leah, meaning have sex with her for a week, and then I'll give you Rachel, and you can work for me for another 7 years for Rachel. So this is where it gets very unromantic to me, okay? So verse 30, Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. So he sleeps with Leah for a week. Then he takes Rachel as his wife also. It's a horrible situation. What did we learn in Genesis 2 about marriage? It's between one man and one woman. What should have Jacob done? Even though he was wronged, what should he have done when he woke up next to Leah? He should have taken his wife and gone home. That would have been the right thing to do. Instead, he takes another wife. Please remember that just because we see polygamy in the Bible, that does not mean that God smiles on it. In fact, if we trace it back in Genesis, we see that every time these men take on another wife or concubine, it results in a whole list of Israel's enemies being born. What we are seeing here is not a beautiful story of 12 offspring. We are seeing how God works through terrible circumstances to bring about his will anyway. Verse 31, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Jacob doesn't just love Rachel more. He hates Leah. Every time he looks at Leah, he probably thinks how he was fooled. And as a deceiver himself, do you think he liked that? No way. He likes to make others feel like a fool. He does not want to be a fool himself. And so he's reminded of that every time he looks at her. But God saw Leah. He opened her womb. Leah gives birth to 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. We see in the way that she named each son that she hopes that these children will finally bring her the love and favor from her husband. You can almost hear her begging, "Love me. Choose me." It's heartbreaking. Chapter 30, verse 1. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." This is probably the first time in her life that Rachel looked with envy upon her sister. Leah has something that Rachel doesn't, and Rachel does not like that feeling. She tells Jacob to give her children or she will die. The irony of this statement is that God will give her children, and she will die, giving birth to her second child. So now we get into some really, really great theology. There's a lot of sarcasm in that statement, okay? As these 2 women vie for the love and honor from their husband. When Laban gave his daughters to Jacob, he also gave them a female servant, okay? Zilpah accompanied Leah, and Bilhah accompanied Rachel. Rachel tells Jacob he can have children through Bilhah. Is that ringing any bells? Right? We saw propose the same plan. Just like Hagar, absolutely no choice in something is culturally in the kingdom of God. For all intents and purposes, it was rape. These women owned by these people. They had no choice. God continues to use sinful people to, and we see Bilhah had 2 after Leah, Zilpah, Asher, breaks, which right? So seems to be the favored one, as we see it throughout the story. Leah agrees, and again we see just how desperate she is for her husband's love and attention. Leah ends up having 3 more children that we see recorded here. 2 sons, Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah, who will have an important role as we continue on. Verses 22 through 24. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." So in our homework, we had a chance to keep score, so to speak, of all of these children, right? Because honestly, that's what this was. It was a baby war to win their husband's favor. Are either of these 2 women finding happiness or fulfillment as this baby war continues? No. It's a terrible, heartbreaking story about 2 women consumed with obtaining the affection of a man who is self-centered and only concerned with his own well-being. Leah seems to spend her whole life begging Jacob to love and choose her. We see later in this story when Jacob goes to meet Esau, he lines up his family. Did you notice the order? Leah and her children are placed in front of Rachel and her son, not because they were in a place of honor, because they were disposable. But God. Ladies, this is so important. Did you notice who Leah's 4th son was? Judah. If you look at Matthew chapter 1, who is Jacob's son that is listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ? Judah. God chose Leah. Jacob may have chosen Rachel time and time again, but God chose Leah. This is why I say, Jacob, when he woke up next to Leah, he should have taken his wife and gone home. Leah was going to be the one who would bring the seed, who would crush the head of the serpent. Additionally, Leah is a type or a shadow of Christ. When we say that someone is a type in the Bible, what we are saying is that that character is pointing us toward what will be fully revealed later on. So let's think about Leah. Here's a woman who has nothing about her appearance that is to be desired, right? And we know that that's true of Jesus, as Isaiah tells us. She was rejected through her whole life, just as Jesus was rejected. But ultimately, she is given the place of honor because it was through her that the seed came that would ultimately crush the head of the serpent. Did she get to see that promise fulfilled in her lifetime? No. No. Is our faith strong enough to hold on to God's promises even when we don't get to see them on this side of heaven? Okay, we still have a bit of story of Jacob to wrestle through, pun intended, before we get to this infamous wrestling match. So we see Jacob finally asks Laban to go home. Laban offers to pay Jacob from the herds, but then he attempts to cheat him, as Laban does. So Jacob comes up with this weird reproductive method with speckled and striped sticks. We see in the text that God had already told Jacob that he would bless him. But once again, Jacob does what Jacob does, and he tries to control it himself. God still blesses Jacob, and the herds increase, even though the sticks were completely unnecessary. In Genesis 31, we see Jacob realize that he's fallen out of favor with Laban. Laban's sons have begun to grumble about Jacob's wealth. God speaks to Jacob and tells him to return home. In verse 13, God describes himself as the God of Bethel. Bethel is where Jacob had his dream and said, "Surely this is the house of the Lord." Jacob flees with his family while Laban is shearing his sheep and gets a 3-day lead. Laban, of course, pursues him. But God warns Laban not to harm Jacob. So Laban does what Laban does, and he sweet talks and he plays the victim. Jacob finally loses it, and he tells Laban, "You have cheated me for 20 years. We're done." So we see them make this covenant, and in chapter 31, verse 49, they swear this oath to each other. "The Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight." And then Laban finally returns home. In Genesis 32, Jacob learns that Esau is coming his way with 400 men, and Jacob is terrified. We understand why, right? Because of their last encounter, Esau was set to kill Jacob. Then in verses 9 through 12, we see Jacob do something we haven't seen him do before. He prays. He says, "O God of my father, Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good.' I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed the Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, 'I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude.'" Notice how Jacob starts this prayer, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, but he doesn't include himself. He has not come to realize God is his God as well, but he will. Jacob spends the night alone, and he wrestles all night with the manifestation of God in the form of a man. It's a weird story, so let's read the text and then we'll talk about it. Verses 22 through 27. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, sons. He had at least 12 we knew of because of Dinah, but this is meaning he took his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. When the man saw that he could not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." So it says that this man, who we know is a manifestation of God, could not prevail against Jacob. Does that mean that God was not strong enough to prevail against Jacob? No. It is illustrating Jacob's persistence. His persistence is unwavering. Jacob continues to push and push and push. He is not willing to rest in the promises of God, to trust God. Jacob continues to force things to go his way, to control the situation, and that's what he's trying to do here. So what does God do? He faithfully wounds Jacob so that Jacob can no longer push. Then God asks, "What is your name?" Jacob answers, "Jacob." But there's so much more wrapped up than just a name. His name means deceiver. Jacob is saying, "I am the deceiver. That's who I am. It covers every part of my being. That's me. I am trying to fool and to work an angle. That's what I do. I'm the deceiver." His very name is a confession of his character. Then God does what God does so well. He renames. Verse 28. Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Israel means he strives with God or God strives. And scholars cannot decide which one is the better translation. But I kind of love that because I think we need both. We know God contends with us, for us. So the name is very fitting. Verse 29. Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it you ask my name?" In ancient cultures, people believed that if you knew someone's name, you had power over them. And God says, "Oh no, I am the one who names and renames." Picking back up in verse 29. "Why is it that you ask my name?" Then he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him again as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. So Jacob walks with a limp for the rest of his life. We see here a pattern of how God breaks, blesses, and renames. This is what God does with every single one of us. We wrestle. We contend. We strive with our Maker until he is faithful to bring us to the end of our resources and breaks us. He gives us a new name. He calls us children of God. But we will never walk with a swagger again. We do not walk away from an encounter with the Almighty unscathed. And we saw that with Jacob. We can also see Jesus in this story. He was broken for us. He received a blessing, and he was given the name above all names. Genesis 33. Jacob arranges his family to meet Esau. He's still terrified about what Esau will do, so he places Leah and her children in front of Rachel in hopes that Rachel and Joseph will survive the encounter. But what do we see? Esau greets Jacob in friendship. It's a beautiful and unexpected reunion. However, Jacob continues to deceive. Jacob tells Esau that he will meet him in Seir, but he has no intention of doing so. Jacob and his family journey to Shechem by way of Succoth, and Jacob erects an altar in Shechem, which is the first place that Abraham erected an altar in Genesis 12. But where should Jacob have gone? Bethel. Twice now, God has said, I am the God of Bethel. But instead, Jacob goes to Shechem, and we will see in just a bit how this plays out to the harm of him and his family. Verse 20. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. That name means God, the God of Israel. We naturally associate that with the nation of Israel, but now knowing the context, what is Jacob saying? God, the God of me. Jacob finally acknowledges God as his God. But it took coming to the end of himself to do so. We're still going to see his name and his character waffle back and forth throughout the rest of his narrative. But isn't that so true of us as well? James even talked about it on Sunday regarding Solomon. Solomon had all the wisdom in the world. But did that mean that he lived a blameless life? Or did he still struggle with the flesh? We can wrestle with God. We can gain all the wisdom in the world. We can be washed clean by the blood of Christ. But we will still battle our sin nature, our flesh. It was true for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's true for us. All right, so now we're going to move into session 7. Thankfully, it was only 3 chapters, but they were heavy chapters, right? We just saw Jacob go through this major shift. He recognizes God as his God and not just his parents' God. But he still struggles with that complete obedience and trust. Pick up with me in Genesis 34, verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father, Hamor, saying, "Give me this girl as my wife." So this passage can feel very confusing, right? First, we've got Shechem, which is both the name of a person and a place. Basically, Hamor, Shechem's father, named the city of Shechem after Shechem, really indicating that Shechem was a very favored child, and we see how that plays out in his actions. This is a man who sees something he wants, and he takes it. It's also confusing, like, did he love Dinah? Did he not love Dinah? But he raped her. Afterwards, he spoke tenderly to her. That does not take away the horror of what he did to her, okay? Moses reminds us right away who Dinah is connected to. She is the daughter of Leah and Jacob. And as we continue on and learn more about this family, we will see that continued conflict between Leah and Rachel's children. And we will see how God uses that conflict to accomplish his purposes. This story of Dinah sets us up for what we will learn about in the life of Joseph. The implications of this story of Dinah will play out through the rest of Genesis. What do we know about Dinah? We know she's Leah's daughter, the only female child listed in this line of babies. Commentators suppose she's probably in her mid-teens, and like most teenagers that I know, most female teenagers that I know, she was curious about what everybody was up to. She wanted to go see what was happening, right? So she did. She's not particularly supervised. Her brothers were out with the flocks. Jacob doesn't seem to be concerned with sending her with a chaperone. It could be because she's Leah's daughter, so he doesn't really care that much about her. But it's not hard to deduce that as a child of Leah and a female, she was disregarded. And we'll see more evidence of that as the story plays out. Shechem sees her, he wants her, he takes her, he rapes her. It's not a romantic story, even though he says he loves her. He feels entitled to get whatever he wants. Verse 5, now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. How do you feel about Jacob here? What would you have wanted to see him do? Maybe cry out to God? Maybe go demand his daughter be returned to him? Maybe show an ounce of emotion? But what do we see? We see nothing. He does nothing. Verses 6-7, and Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. The sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant and very angry because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing must not be done. Dinah's brothers react immediately. This is what we kind of hoped we would have seen out of Jacob, right? But then notice that very interesting editorial right there from Moses about what an outrageous thing this was. If you remember back in our first session, we talked about Genesis being a historical narrative. And in a historical narrative, the author rarely makes an editorial comment or talks about a moral judgment within the story. He assumes you know when to be outraged by something that is immoral. So if we see a moral judgment like this one, we should pay close attention. Moses took this very seriously. In verses 8-12, Hamor comes up with this plan that a way to make this right. He proposes that the daughters of Israel marry the sons of the Canaanites, right? But this is an untenable solution because the children of Israel cannot marry the Canaanites. It is forbidden. Jacob's sons come up with their own deceitful plan. They tell Hamor that if every man in Shechem gets circumcised, they will allow this union. So they go back and convince them to circumcise all the men. But before we look at that, look at the language in verse 17. This is the boys talking, the brothers. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. Jacob had not treated his daughter in the way that he should, but the brothers are determined to honor her, determined to give her the protection she should have had. Their motives are good. Their methods are terrible. Okay, so then Shechem and Hamor go back and they have to convince all of the men. Can you even imagine that conversation? But what's the convincing point here? Look at verse 23. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them and they will dwell with us. They see all the possessions Jacob has and they want them. So they think, okay, fine, we'll be circumcised and eventually we will take all of their possessions. Verses 25-29. On the third day when they were sore, all the men, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. I mean, did it bother any of you that she was still in that house? Days have gone by. I just cannot even imagine. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. They took whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, all that was in the houses they captured and plundered. Is this justice? No, this is revenge. The punishment far exceeds the crime, and it was a terrible, terrible crime. We are not making light of that. Jacob's sons have used the sacred sign of God's covenant as a cover for murder. But here's another example of how God will use anyone for his purposes. Think about Levi. Who comes through Levi's line? The priests of God. Levi starts his heritage by committing this sacrilegious act of murder. But ultimately, his line will be the ones that offer sacrifices to God for the guilt of the Israelites. Verses 30 and 31. When Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the Israelites. me, both I, our sister, about. He's thinking all who were with themselves and change. And we know household indicate that not so they were Jacob's undivided this terrible situation. Verse altar to the has been with. This is a finally verse the rings that was near but before them other for the Israelites because we and I turn but what's God add this other that's how of that 7 of Jacob's hearing what had happened preserves his promise. Rebecca's in there. Rebecca had died. Family. She was so they were 9 through 15. I think that Jacob, no matter good, because Jacob, God, and that he will speak and again life, restoration. Yes. And again, ourselves, bury it. They were Rachel went at its heart and name wrath that is what's to come. Describe my right hand. When Israel went and child number man had one father's property. Reuben was concubine is saying to his huge strain